She was my teacher, calm, brilliant, untouchable. But the way she looked at me that day, it wasn't in the lesson plan. And neither was what came after. The first time I walked into that classroom, I wasn't sure what to expect. It was supposed to be just another evening course, literature, something to fill the gaps in my schedule. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above the rows of old wooden desks, and the faint scent of chalk and paper hung in the air. The hum of conversation faded as the door clicked shut behind me, and then I saw her. She stood near the blackboard, arranging a stack of papers with an easy, practiced grace. A 40-year-old American woman, confident, poised, and effortlessly elegant. Her long black hair was tied back loosely, a few strands framing her face as if time had brushed them there on purpose. She wore a cream blouse tucked into a dark skirt, the kind of outfit that was simple but carried a quiet authority. Her posture was relaxed yet deliberate, as if she'd spent years learning how to make a room listen without ever raising her voice. When her eyes lifted toward me, something in the air seemed to still. They were dark brown, not sharp, but steady, observant. The kind of gaze that made you feel seen, even before you'd spoken a word. "You must be our new student," she said, smiling, the kind of smile that could make even an ordinary introduction feel personal. Her voice was low and measured, carrying warmth under its composure. I nodded, introducing myself, trying not to sound as nervous as I felt. She gestured toward an empty seat near the window. I caught the faint scent of her perfume as I passed, subtle, like clean linen and something floral. I sat down, pretending to focus on the notebook in front of me, but my attention kept drifting back to her. As she began the lesson, her words flowed effortlessly, as if the lines of every book she quoted lived within her. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the desk as she spoke, drawing invisible shapes in the air. The students listened quietly, but for me, her voice filled every corner of that room. Every movement she made seemed intentional, the turn of her wrist as she wrote on the board, the way she leaned slightly forward when she wanted us to think harder. I couldn't explain it, but it was as though the room revolved around her, her energy, her calm command. When she turned to ask a question, her eyes found mine again, holding for just a second longer than necessary. I stumbled over my answer, earning a soft, amused smile from her, not mocking, just understanding. By the time class ended, I realized I hadn't taken many notes. My pages were mostly blank, except for a single line I'd written absent-mindedly at the top. Some lessons aren't about what's written on the board. As everyone began to leave, I lingered, pretending to check my bag. She looked up from her papers, meeting my eyes again. "You'll catch up quickly," she said, that same faint smile playing at her lips. "You seem like someone who pays attention." I left the room that night with her voice still echoing in my mind, calm, knowing, and far too easy to remember. The days that followed weren't dramatic, but they were charged in a way I hadn't expected. Each class felt like stepping into a world slightly removed from the ordinary, the hum of fluorescent lights, the scent of old books, the soft scrape of her heels against the floor, and always, her presence at the front of the room. She was 40 years old, an American Caucasian woman with long black hair cascading over her shoulders, lightly tanned skin, and subtle laugh lines that hinted at the years of experience behind her poised composure. Her dark brown eyes were both observant and gentle, carrying a warmth I didn't know how to interpret. After class one evening, she lingered as I approached her desk with a question about the reading. I had expected a quick answer, maybe a polite redirection. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her fingers tapping lightly on the stack of papers before her. Her blouse caught the light, cream fabric soft against her skin, and I found myself distracted by the casual elegance of her posture. When she looked up, her eyes met mine in a way that made me pause. That brief moment, framed by the quiet rustle of the classroom, carried a weight I couldn't define. We began to talk more often after class. At first, it was just about assignments, passages from books, themes in poetry. But soon, the conversation stretched, literature became a doorway to deeper things. She spoke of her favorite authors, memories from her own college days, reflections on choices she'd made and the lessons they had taught her. Her voice was calm, low, and infused with a natural warmth. I noticed how she'd tuck her hair behind her ear when she thought, the subtle shift in her posture when she leaned in slightly, or the way her fingers hovered over the edge of the desk before resting them lightly. During these moments, the air seemed to thicken with unspoken tension. A laugh would come and fade, leaving a charged silence that neither of us broke immediately. When our hands brushed while exchanging papers or adjusting a chair, the contact lingered longer than it should have, and I could feel my pulse quicken despite the casual nature of the gesture. One rainy evening, I stayed after class again. The classroom was nearly empty, the faint patter of water against the window filling the gaps in conversation. She gestured for me to take a seat near the window as she adjusted the blinds. The room smelled faintly of rain and paper, the light softened by the gray outside. As we spoke, her dark brown eyes held mine, attentive and warm. I realized that even in silence, the smallest gestures, a tilt of her head, the curve of her smile, the slight lean forward, carried a subtle intimacy that was impossible to ignore. By the end of the session, I was acutely aware of every detail, the sound of her voice lingering in my ears, the faint warmth of her presence in the space beside me, the soft brush of her sleeve against my arm when she handed me a pen. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but I couldn't shake it. The line between student and teacher, professional and personal, began to blur in ways that felt delicate, inevitable, and quietly thrilling. Every glance, every word, every small touch carried meaning. And with each passing day, the tension grew, unspoken but undeniable, a thread winding gently between us, pulling tighter with each class. It was one of those evenings when the rain came down in sheets, tapping insistently against the classroom windows, drumming a rhythm that seemed almost alive. The lesson had ended, but the room was too empty, too still, to leave just yet. She, the 40-year-old American Caucasian woman with long black hair, lightly tanned skin, and a graceful, curvy figure, had offered that I wait until the storm passed. She remained at her desk, papers scattered around her, the lamplight casting a soft glow across the room and highlighting the subtle laugh lines around her dark brown eyes. Sitting across from her, I felt the space between us contract in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The familiar rhythm of her voice during class was replaced by a quiet intimacy, even the slightest exhale she let out seemed magnified in the stillness. She removed her glasses and leaned back slightly, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk, the gesture casual but deliberate. Every movement she made seemed carefully weighted, as if she knew exactly how each small detail would echo. "You remind me of someone," she said softly, almost in passing, her gaze drifting toward the window before returning to me. "Someone who used to believe in things, passionately." There was a wistfulness in her tone, a vulnerability carefully tucked beneath the calm confidence she wore during lessons. The words were not directed as a lesson, not an attempt to instruct, but somehow, they felt like a gift, a glimpse into a life she rarely exposed to anyone. I wanted to respond, but the usual certainty I carried in conversation had evaporated. Instead, I leaned slightly forward, resting my elbows on the desk, absorbing the cadence of her voice. The faint scent of her perfume, a blend of something floral and crisp, mingled with the damp, earthy aroma of the rain outside. The sound of droplets against the windows filled the gaps between her sentences, underscoring every pause and breath. We spoke of books first, then drifted into more personal territory. She told small stories from her past, moments of regret, moments of quiet triumph, and I found myself revealing things I rarely said aloud, ambitions I still hesitated to pursue, memories I cherished, fears I hadn't shared. Her eyes softened with each admission, her long black hair catching the lamplight as she tucked a loose strand behind her ear. For a moment, it felt as if the rain outside had become irrelevant, it was only her presence that mattered, steady and grounding. When the storm finally eased, the classroom seemed transformed. The air was thick with a quiet charge, a tension that hadn't been there before. We moved to close the windows together, and our hands brushed, lightly, accidentally, yet neither of us pulled away immediately. The touch was fleeting, but it lingered in memory, in the quiet space that now existed between us. As I stepped out into the wet evening air, the echo of her voice followed me. Not just her words, but the cadence, the warmth, the intimacy of her presence. The night had shifted something delicate and undeniable between us. The boundary of student and teacher, which had always felt clear, now trembled with unspoken possibility. And in that trembling, I realized, some lessons aren't written on the board, they unfold in moments like these, between rain, words, and quiet understanding. Days passed after the evening of the storm, but nothing about the classroom felt the same. Even the routine of lessons carried a new weight, a tension that hovered beneath the normal flow of teaching, subtle yet undeniable. The 40-year-old American Caucasian woman with long black hair, lightly tanned skin, and a graceful, curvy figure moved through her lessons with the same poised confidence, yet there was a softness to her gaze that hadn't been there before, a flicker of something unspoken in her dark brown eyes. It happened during a discussion about a particularly emotional passage in a novel. She reached for a book on her desk just as I moved to collect the same copy from the stack beside her. Our hands met briefly. Just a brush, a casual touch, and yet it carried a spark neither of us could ignore. My chest tightened instinctively, and I could feel the subtle warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of her blouse. She froze for the slightest fraction of a second, her eyes lifting to meet mine, and in that instant, the classroom seemed suspended in a delicate, fragile balance. Her lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to say something, a word, a warning, a reassurance, but instead, she only let out a soft, almost imperceptible exhale and drew back just enough to shift the moment into ambiguity. The line between teacher and student, so firmly drawn by years of societal expectation, felt thinner than it ever had before. The unspoken tension hovered over us, a quiet awareness that something real had been acknowledged without a single word. I returned to my seat, my fingers tingling from the brief contact, my heart beating a little faster than usual. Her hands smoothed the stack of books in front of her, and when she looked up, her eyes held the faintest trace of a smile, a signal that she too had felt the current of something deeper. Yet she continued the lesson with calm composure, her voice steady, professional, yet warmer somehow. Each glance in my direction carried subtle undertones, small gestures that spoke louder than the words she spoke aloud. The rest of the class passed in a blur of observation and internal reflection. I noticed how she would lean slightly forward when emphasizing a point, the soft curve of her shoulders when she moved across the room, the gentle brushing of hair from her face, all details magnified in my awareness. Every small motion felt laden with meaning, each pause a question neither of us dared to ask aloud. After the class ended, she collected her materials quickly, though not without a faint tremor in her hands that betrayed the controlled calm she maintained. I lingered behind, pretending to pack slowly, stealing glances at her from the corner of my eye. There was a silent conversation in the way she moved, the way she looked at me, the almost imperceptible sigh she let out as she gathered her papers. Walking away from the classroom that day, I realized that a boundary had shifted. It wasn't crossed, not yet, but the line had been felt, tested, and acknowledged. It was the kind of tension that would linger long after the desks were cleared, in quiet moments between glances, in the air charged with what remained unspoken. The unspoken line wasn't a barrier anymore, it was a delicate thread connecting us, taut with possibility and restrained desire, a quiet acknowledgement that some lessons were never in the syllabus. The weeks blurred together, each class a familiar rhythm of discussion and analysis, yet beneath the surface, something between us had shifted. The 40-year-old American Caucasian woman with long black hair, lightly tanned skin, and a graceful, curvy figure carried herself with her usual poise, but now there was a subtle warmth in her gaze whenever it lingered on me, a quiet invitation hidden behind professional composure. Her dark brown eyes seemed to see more than they let on, softening when our hands brushed over papers or when our shoulders came close during small group activities. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled through the blinds in golden streaks across the classroom, she asked me to read a passage from a poem aloud. My voice wavered slightly at first, but as I continued, the words, about longing, restraint, and unspoken desires, seemed to echo more deeply than intended. The room felt suspended, the other students fading into the background. All I could see was her, the curve of her lips, the tilt of her head, the way her long black hair caught the light, and the slight arch of her eyebrow that always hinted at amusement or thoughtfulness. When I finished, the room was quiet. She didn't applaud, didn't comment immediately. Instead, her dark brown eyes met mine with a steadiness that made my chest tighten. "Sometimes," she said softly, her voice carrying across the quiet, "the things we can't say, write themselves through others." There was no judgment, no lecture, only a gentle acknowledgement of a shared understanding. The words hung in the air, delicate and layered, like a secret passed silently between us. Her hands rested lightly on the desk, fingers entwined briefly as if to anchor herself, and I noticed the faint tremor in her movements, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet impossible to ignore. The air felt charged, the kind of tension that wasn't physical but emotional, a pull that drew attention and thought inward. I realized she had spoken not as a teacher to a student, but as someone acknowledging the delicate, unspoken truths that lingered between us. As the class ended, she gathered her books quickly, avoiding eye contact for a moment. The faint brush of her hand against mine as she collected a stray sheet of paper left a warmth lingering on my skin. There was no overt confession, no declaration, only the nuanced, careful expression of something more profound than words could capture. It was in the quiet glances, the pauses, the way her posture shifted when she thought I wasn't looking. Walking out of the classroom that day, I replayed every detail, the soft exhale she made when she spoke, the gentle curve of her smile, the faint tremor in her hands, the subtle brush of her fingers against mine. Every gesture was imbued with a meaning I couldn't fully name, a confession disguised as literature, an intimacy that existed in shared moments rather than spoken aloud. It was clear that the lesson she had imparted went far beyond the pages of poetry or the structure of a classroom discussion. She had taught me about patience, subtlety, and the power of what remains unsaid. And in that delicate, suspended moment, I understood that our connection had evolved, quiet, restrained, and deeply alive, leaving both of us on the cusp of something neither dared to name openly. The semester's final class had ended, leaving an unusual stillness in the campus corridors. I found her standing near the school gate, framed by the warm glow of the late afternoon sun. She was 40 years old, an American Caucasian woman with long black hair cascading over her shoulders, lightly tanned skin, subtle freckles, and soft laugh lines that gave her a graceful, mature beauty. Her dark brown eyes, usually composed and attentive in the classroom, held a rare vulnerability, a quiet honesty reserved for moments when the world felt private. She held a folder close to her chest, fingers gripping it lightly but with care, as if it anchored her to something familiar. The wind teased strands of her hair across her face, and she brushed them aside with the same gentle precision I had noticed in class, every movement fluid, deliberate, yet seemingly effortless. The afternoon light caught her profile in a way that made her silhouette radiant, softening her professional composure into something tender, human. We walked slowly together along the sidewalk, the quiet hum of distant traffic and the chirping of birds filling the spaces between words. Our conversation was light at first, reminders of assignments, next steps in our studies, but beneath the polite cadence was a current neither of us dared to name. Every now and then, our shoulders brushed, just enough to spark awareness but never enough to cross a line. At one point, she stopped, turning slightly to face me. "You've grown a lot this semester," she said softly, her tone carrying warmth without the strictness of a teacher. Her gaze lingered on mine, dark brown eyes steady and unflinching, holding an unspoken question. I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and hesitation, the kind that comes from realizing the boundary between respect and something deeper has shifted. She extended her hand, offering the customary farewell gesture. I took it, fingers lightly entwining with hers. The touch was fleeting, yet it sent a ripple through me, grounding and thrilling at the same time. Her skin was warm, lightly tanned, and the subtle strength in her grip contrasted with the delicate way her fingers brushed mine. She didn't pull away, holding the contact just long enough for the world to contract around us. We stood like that for a few quiet moments, neither speaking, both aware of the gravity and the simplicity of a hand held. The wind rustled through nearby trees, the afternoon light fading gently, yet all I could see was her curvy figure poised confidently, yet softened by the intimacy of the moment, the long black hair catching the sun, the the faint lines around her eyes deepening as she allowed herself this small vulnerability. Finally, she released my hand, her fingers brushing mine in a motion that felt deliberate yet effortless. "Take care," she murmured, her voice steady but infused with a subtle warmth that lingered far longer than the words themselves. I watched her walk away, the folder tucked under her arm, the sunlight tracing her outline, every detail of her presence etched into my memory. The world around me resumed its usual pace, but something within me had changed, the quiet recognition of what had been shared, the suspended tension that now existed between us, and the delicate possibility of a connection that neither time nor convention could erase. In that brief, unspoken moment outside the classroom, it became clear, some lessons extend far beyond the walls of a school, lingering quietly in the spaces between touch, glance, and breath. Weeks had passed since the final class, and the world seemed to have returned to its usual rhythm, bustling streets, the predictable noise of campus life, and the quiet hum of distant traffic. Yet for me, something remained suspended, delicate and persistent, a memory that refused to fade. The 40-year-old American Caucasian woman with long black hair, lightly tanned skin, subtle freckles, and graceful curves had left an imprint far beyond the pages of the books we had studied together. Her dark brown eyes, the gentle tilt of her head, the soft smile that had lingered in moments when we were alone, all of it replayed vividly in my mind. It was a quiet afternoon when an envelope arrived at my apartment. Her handwriting was elegant, precise, and unmistakably hers. I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of anticipation and curiosity. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper, folded carefully. Opening it, I read her note: "Some lessons don't belong in a classroom." I sat by the window, sunlight pouring in, illuminating the small space around me. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, not from fear, but from the quiet exhilaration of understanding. Her words weren't a confession, at least not in the traditional sense, yet they carried everything we had shared, the glances, the brief touches, the moments when words were unnecessary. The note encapsulated the delicate tension that had defined our time together, the invisible thread connecting us beyond the formalities of teacher and student. I thought back to that last afternoon outside the school gate. The way her hand had lingered in mine, the subtle warmth of her touch, and the quiet acknowledgement in her gaze, all of it now felt like a lesson in restraint, intimacy, and human connection. It wasn't about romantic gestures or dramatic declarations, it was about the beauty of moments fully felt, even if they remained unspoken. Sitting there, I realized that our story had its own rhythm, one that didn't conform to expectation or societal norms. The age difference, the roles we played, none of it diminished the truth of our bond. In fact, it gave it a depth that was rare and quietly profound. I smiled faintly, tracing the curve of her words on the paper, understanding that the greatest lessons are often those that linger quietly, shaping perception, feeling, and memory. Even in her absence, her presence remained palpable. I could almost hear her voice in the soft rustle of pages, the hum of sunlight on the floor, and the faint scent of perfume that seemed to linger long after a classroom had emptied. Every detail, every nuance of our interactions, had been preserved in my awareness, like an imprint that refused to fade with time. And yet, the note left a gentle ambiguity, a suspended possibility that allowed the memory to exist without need for closure. There was no rush to define it, no pressure to act. The lesson had been delivered, subtle and unspoken, and it had transformed something within me: patience, perception, and the understanding that connection isn't always about possession or clarity. Some lessons, I realized, are meant to stay with you. They aren't completed, they aren't resolved, they exist as quiet truths that shape the way you see the world and yourself. And in that quiet, suspended space, the memory of her, the 40-year-old American Caucasian woman with long black hair, graceful presence, and steady warmth, remained, a gentle, enduring lesson I would carry far beyond the classroom, beyond time itself.